What makes a good paper? The fundamental part of any good paper is the research question. Has anyone here ever picked up a paper and they've had no idea what the paper's about? Is that because you're an idiot? No. It's because they haven't articulated the research question. It's all about the research question. If the authors can clearly articulate what the question is, you can more or less understand any paper. But if you read it and you've got no idea what it's about, it's not your fault, it's the author's fault for not clearly articulating the question. So the first thing as a reviewer, the first thing you've got to do is you find out what is the research about, what is the question. Is there a question in the paper? If there's no question in the paper, it's extremely difficult to review the paper. You then ask yourself, is this important? Is it relevant? Are they answering a question that people want answered? Or are they asking a question where nobody cares? You ask, is it original and is it plausible? Types of questions. For qualitative research, different types of papers have different types of questions, but there's always a question. So if we consider vomiting, a qualitative paper may say, what is the vomiting experience after anaesthesia? A quantitative observational descriptive study might say, the question might be, how often do people vomit after anaesthesia? A quantitative observational analytical study might say, what are the factors associated with vomiting after anaesthesia? And if you were doing a trial, it could be, does intervention X reduce vomiting compared to intervention Y? No matter what the type of paper, there is always a question. Is there a hypothesis? Is there a clearly articulated aim which is linked to the implied question? So we tend to talk about questions, aims, hypotheses and objectives. And I always get a bit confused as to which is which. They're all pretty much the same. The questions are most important, but somewhat weirdly, we don't actually ask people to articulate their question. They ask to articulate their aim or their hypothesis, which is actually based on the question. It might be easier if we ask people to actually articulate what the question is rather than the aim, because the aim is to answer the question, so therefore what's the question? You don't always need a hypothesis. For example, in qualitative research or in some quantitative research, you don't actually have to have a hypothesis, but you do have to have an aim. The introduction is all about the what? The question. Excellent. Someone can read. The introduction is all about the question. At the end of the introduction, you should know what the question is and what the aim of the paper is. There are various ways that people write introductions. Often you can say what is known, what isn't known, what's the gap and why is filling the gap important, and how are we going to fill the gap. They're the basic elements of the introduction. It should include the aim or aims, and it should articulate a primary aim. So if there are multiple aims, they should say this is the primary aim, but then they should indicate the other aims and potentially a hierarchy of the aims. The introduction should not be a literature review. The literature review is a separate piece of work. If the introduction is long and just has a lot of words, you should be concerned. Now, if it takes 2,000 words to persuade you that the question is important, then it's likely that the question is not important. A nice, succinct introduction is a good indication of a good paper. They should be able to articulate, this is the problem, this is what we know, this is what we don't know, this is how we're going to work out what the answer is. Simple. That's why we say introduction should be 200, 300 words at the most. If it's more than that, there's something wrong with the paper. The question, the typical way of defining a question is the population, the intervention, the exposure, the comparator, the outcome and the time frame, often summarised as PICO and PICO. When you're reading a clinical research project, you should be able to discover this fairly early on in the method section. Of course, the most important part is the outcome, and that's where most papers have issues. When you're looking at the outcome, you have to ask, does it actually matter? Are they reporting an outcome which people care about? Does the outcome that they're reporting actually relate to their question? If it's a surrogate outcome, how strong is that link between the surrogate outcome and real outcomes? For example, blood loss is really just a surrogate outcome for complications of transfusion, but we accept it as a reasonably good surrogate outcome because there's a fairly strong link between the two. Primary and secondary outcomes. There should be, how many primary outcomes should there be? Well, primary, one. What does primary mean? One. I'm always amused when people say these are the primary outcomes. I feel you can't have, it's like saying you've got multiple presidents. There's only one. It's primary means one. Why do we only have one primary aim and one primary outcome? The main reason is it hangs the whole paper together. If you have one aim, one primary outcome, then that is a thread which goes through the whole paper. If people start off with one aim or multiple aims and then they sort of emphasise this one in the introduction, then they emphasise another one in the results and then another one in the discussion, then the reader sort of loses thread of the whole paper. So the main reason for having a primary aim and a primary outcome is it links everything together through the whole paper. And if there isn't that thread, then you should note there isn't that thread and ask the authors to restructure their paper and rewrite the paper to have that thread through the paper. They can, of course, have secondary outcomes and secondary aims. They could describe different aspects of the primary outcome. For example, you could have vomiting in the first 6 hours as your primary outcome, but then you might have vomiting in the first 24 hours as a secondary outcome, or nausea. So secondary outcomes and secondary aims often describe different dimensions of the primary outcome. And one reason for doing that is because what you think is important may not be what all the readers think is most important. So that's one reason why we report multiple secondary outcomes. Other outcomes could, of course, be safety economics aspects to it, or it could be a completely different question, and it might be quite different to the primary question. If there are sort of two quite different aims in the paper or two quite different questions, then you should sort of ask yourself, should they actually be in the same paper, or could we actually have two different papers here? Methods, very simple. Does the methodology answer the question? Is the experiment reproducible? Is there jargon? Is the population defined? At the end, I'll put up my email address, and if anybody would like a copy of my presentation, I'm very happy to email them to you. Is there jargon? Is the population defined? Are the interventions clearly described? Are the outcome measures clearly valid and completely described? And is the outcome measure actually valid? They're all things you look for in the methods. Is there if it's a trial, is there blinding? What's the randomisation? Is there ethical approval? Is there consent? And if the trial is registered, then you should go and look up the registration to see whether what people are reporting in the paper is the same as what they've registered. And increasingly, observational studies are also registered. So you can go up and see whether what they've reported in their study is what they said. Now, if there's things that are not, if they've sort of jiggled around the primary aim and the primary aim has become, in the registration, has become the secondary aim in the paper, then you should ask the authors why they've done that. If there are things that they said they were going to measure in the registration and they haven't reported it in the paper, you should ask the authors why haven't they reported them, and preferably they should report them. Statistics. The first part is there should be a number justification. It should be based on the primary aim and the primary outcome. The number justification should always be based on the primary aim and the primary outcome. Good papers, however, also will have some sort of power analysis of secondary outcomes as well, but not always. If it looks a bit contrived, then one simple thing to do is just to ask them, what did they tell the IRB? And just put in the paper what you said to the IRB or to the Animal Ethics Committee. The argument that the authors generated for that should be the same as the argument that goes in the paper. The statistics section should also describe how the data will be summarised, any details in inferential statistics, how missingness is managed, and was there an a priori analysis plan, and which analyses were post hoc, and as I said, have all analyses been reported. Now, an analysis plan is something is usually a fairly detailed document. It can be dozens of pages long or hundreds of pages long, where they clearly describe how data are actually going to be analysed and reported. And it's very important that you know whether that analysis plan was generated before the researchers started looking at the data. And that means looking at the data in any form. So they should indicate in the paper if there was an a priori analysis plan, and they should indicate which analyses were a priori and which were post hoc. The reason why this is important is because you want to unpick if there's what's called data-driven analysis. Did the authors actually know what the data looked like before they formulated the question? Now, this can also apply to some retrospective studies. This is an interesting problem. We published a paper a while ago where we looked at, someone reported the number of complications they'd had after a particular procedure at their institution. And they looked back over the last 20 years and they'd had no complications at all with this particular procedure. And I thought, that's really interesting. This is a really safe thing to do. But then afterwards I thought, they probably knew they didn't have any complications, and that's why they went back and looked to see if they had any complications. But they already knew they had none. If they had had some, then they probably wouldn't have bothered to go back and look to see what their complication rate is. So data-driven analyses can be quite subtle and can be quite difficult to actually pull out in a paper. So you could ask them and say, why did you do that retrospective analysis? What triggered you to do that retrospective analysis? And they may have to honestly respond, well, we did it because we knew what we were going to find. No, they won't say that, but you could ask. So what is the problem with a data-driven analysis? Well, the way that the scientific method works is we make observations. We sort of sit there and you look at the world or look at data. You think of interesting questions. From those, you formulate hypotheses. You then go away, develop testable predictions. You do an experiment where you gather more data, and then you see whether your predictions were correct, and if they are, then you generate a theory, develop a general theory, which is a model. That's how scientific method works. Now, if you're doing a data-driven analysis, what you're doing is you're basically not collecting new data. So you just go straight from formulating a hypothesis which you sort of already knew was going to be true, straight through to saying, oh yes, it is true. So there's nothing wrong with data-driven analysis, but they have to be indicated as hypothesis generating rather than hypothesis proving. The results should also indicate the setting, the dates that the study were done. It's very important that people say exactly when the study was done, when was the first patient recruited, when was the analysis done. Describe the population, as I said, the primary outcome, the secondary outcome, and the post hoc analyses. You can also look and see if there was any missingness and how the missingness is indicated. If you really want, you can add up the numbers in the tables and see whether they actually add up. It's surprising the number of times they don't. And it tends to be not because researchers are evil. It tends to be because in multiple different drafts or when they're transferring data, sometimes they make honest errors. And it's surprising how often that actually happens and it isn't picked up until the last minute. You should see whether the raw data are adequately presented, and if there are error bars, what do the error bars actually mean? Now, when you're thinking about the results, certainly in clinical research, you've got to think there are two key aspects to the results of any analysis. There's the magnitude and the degree of uncertainty and precision. Now, the magnitude, or the effect size, is often the difference between the means or medians, or it's the strength of association, or the correlation coefficient, or the odds ratio and the risk ratio. It's surprisingly often that you see papers which don't actually report the effect size. They might compare two different treatments, and they'll say, this was the outcome in that treatment, that's the outcome in that treatment, but they don't actually ever report the difference between the two. But that is really the primary, that's what you're really interested in. What is the difference between two? What is the effect size? And then they report the degree of uncertainty or precision, which is traditionally indicated with a p-value or a 95% confidence interval. So why do we bang on and on and on about 95% confidence intervals? Why do we keep sending papers back saying, please put in the 95% confidence intervals? The reason is because compared to just the p-values, they provide a much better indication of the effect size and the power of the study. The 95% confidence interval is a little bit difficult to get your head around, and I'll come back to it, but it basically means if the true value lies outside the interval, there's a 5% chance the sampling error occurred by chance. That's not quite right, and Tim will probably thump me in a minute, but it sort of means something roughly like that. So,
B plus.
B plus, excellent, good. So why do 95% confidence intervals help? Well, if you're doing a study here and you say, well, this is the effect size, we put around our 95% confidence interval and, whoopee, it doesn't cross zero, so therefore, great, we've got a p-value of less than 0.05, and we can say there's evidence for a difference. Yes, we've got to get published. However, if that's what's clinically meaningful, yes, we've got a p-value that's less than 0.05, but the bounds of the confidence interval are actually less than what's clinically meaningful. So in fact, we found evidence for a difference, but there's evidence for no clinically relevant difference. So if you just report the p-values, you don't actually capture that information. Of course, what really should drive practice would be if the 95% confidence interval, the lower bounds, was actually above or beyond something that's clinically meaningful. We actually see very, very few studies which are like this, and the vast majority are in fact like this, where the confidence intervals doesn't cross zero, so you get the magical less than 0.05, but there's also, when you look at it, you think, well, it's borderline whether it's clinically meaningful. So providing the 95% confidence interval allows the reader to have a better understanding of the precision and the effect size rather than just a p-value. Of course, it's all very well to say, well, here it is relative to the clinically meaningful difference, but that might be what you might think that's clinically meaningful, and some people might think that's clinically meaningful. So beware when people define what is clinically meaningful, because the reader may not actually agree with you or the author. What if the p-value is greater than 0.05? Well, you could find this, damn, greater than 0.05, not going to get published. However, if that's what's clinically meaningful, yes, the p-value is greater than 0.05, but the confidence intervals are within what's clinically meaningful, so you can then conclude we actually have evidence for no difference. And this is very useful information. But once again, if you just report the p-value, you don't give the reader the idea of that information. Of course, if you find this result, then really this is no evidence for anything, because the confidence intervals are way beyond where there could be no difference or there could be something that's clinically meaningful. So 95% confidence intervals provide a better indication of effect size and power, which is why we ask for them and why you should ask for them. But there's still the temptation to interpret the boundaries as meaning something is significant or not. And this goes to the whole problem of 0.05 and the idea of statistical significance. Now, you've got to understand that the 0.05 is a fairly arbitrary cutoff. If we use it because I asked an editor for The Lancet, I said, why do you still have 0.05? And he laughed and he said, it's convenient, but don't worry, everybody knows it's rubbish. So we use it because it's convenient. However, you should be careful, because using 0.05 as a threshold of something being statistically significant or not is a degree arbitrary. So if the results, the p-value or the 95% confidence interval is close to 0.05 or it's close to zero, then perhaps the authors should be a little bit more tempered in their conclusions. However, if they say that they're defining 0.05 as statistically significant, then they've stuck their necks out, and for the whole paper, they have to indicate whether something is statistically significant or not. So you can't have it both ways. You can say, we regard 0.05 as being statistically significant, and then they write, oh, but there was a trend, so maybe it really does mean something. You either decide it's statistically significant or not, one way or the other. There's a lot of push at the moment to get rid of 0.05 and statistical significance, which I won't talk about today, but it's very much a watch this space. We all agree to get rid of 0.05, but nobody really knows what to replace it with. So at the moment, we're more or less stuck with it. Interestingly, anyone know who this guy is? Sorry? Fisher, exactly. And where did 0.05 come from? In 1926, he was doing an experiment. He was an agriculturalist where he was spreading cow manure on different paddocks. And he decided that 0.05, why did he justify it? He said, personally, the writer prefers a settled standard about 5 0.05% point. So he chose 0.05 sort of fairly arbitrarily in a large experiment where they were spreading cow manure on different paddocks. Say no more. The other problem is the whole frequentist approach. And I'm not going to tell you all to do Bayesian statistics, but I'm going to tell you to think like a Bayesian. That sounds like a song, doesn't it? Think like a Bayesian. Sorry. So, how do we interpret p-values and 95% confidence interval? Well, the p-value doesn't indicate the likelihood of something is true. We tend to think that, but it isn't actually what it is. A 0.05 merely means there's a 1 in 20 chance of finding that result if the null hypothesis in the population isn't true. Doesn't mean there's a 95% chance it's true in the population or a 5% chance it's untrue in the population. It provides no direct information about the population, only about the sample. Using that what's called frequentist approach, it's actually very difficult to get your head around what a p-value and what a 95% confidence interval actually means. And the simplistic idea that if it's less than 0.05 means something is likely to be true is completely wrong. So how do we get around that when we're looking at a paper? Well, the answer is to have a Bayesian approach. And this is Bayes. He was, I think, an 18th century German pastor who described Bayes' theorem. He wrote it down somewhere, he died, and then someone was going through his possessions and thought, what's that? And someone thought, oh, that's pretty interesting. So it was discovered after he died, which I thought was pretty cool. Anyway, Bayesian approach is simply the strength of the evidence after the study. So the strength of the evidence in the population after the study is the strength of the evidence in the population before the study multiplied by the new evidence of the study. So this allows the author to actually give an estimate of the probability in the population rather than just in the sample. So once again, I'm saying, I'm not telling you should all use Bayesian statistics in your analysis, but you should think like a Bayesian, or the author should think like a Bayesian when they're interpreting their results. So the strength or the total evidence after the study is determined by the strength of evidence before the study, which could be effect size, the certainty, the quality of previous studies, including biological plausibility, multiplied by the new evidence of the study, which is the effect size, the quality of the current report. And you put the two together, and then that should give you, the authors, the indication of what to believe afterwards or what to recommend afterwards. And Steve Schaefer wrote a very nice editorial about this about 10 years ago in ANA, where he's basically summarised it saying, extraordinary claims demand extraordinary proof. The discussion. Now, the opening paragraph of the discussion should indicate the answer to the primary question. I find discussions a bit boring to read, but anyway, they're often the hardest to write. But if you sort of follow this particular format, it's easier to see what is a good discussion and what isn't. So your opening paragraph is saying, this was the answer to the question, woohoo. Then you summarise and evaluate the previous knowledge. You indicate how your study fits with the previous knowledge, the strengths and weaknesses of your current study and the previous study, and then you put it all together, and that gives some indication of future directions or some conclusion. Now, what is this? It's a Bayesian equation. So the discussion is basically a Bayesian equation. You're saying, this is what we found, this is what we knew before, and the quality of what we knew before, this is what we found in this paper, therefore this is what we recommend. It's a simple Bayesian equation. So thinking like a Bayesian, you don't have to do Bayesian statistics, but when it comes to interpreting your study, or interpreting the study, you should see if the authors are actually acting like a Bayesian. Pitfalls of discussions, too long, it's not a literature review, don't repeat the introduction, overemphasis on secondary questions and secondary outcomes is often a problem in a discussion, too much speculation, you should pull them up on, and if the importance is overemphasised. It's very tempting if you put years of work into a paper to overemphasise it. If the authors say they're the first to do something, then try and find out if they really are, because nearly always they're not. Secondary outcomes. Now, secondary outcomes are secondary outcomes for a reason. when people define their primary outcome, the author defines the primary outcome as that is what's most important. And the secondary outcomes are secondary because they think they're interesting, but not as important. So if in the paper they define the primary outcome or the primary aim, but then in this discussion they spend ages and ages and ages saying, well, if they in the primary outcome they didn't find what they liked and there was no effect, but they then emphasise the secondary outcome, then that's not really logical because they decided a priori that the primary outcome was the most important. So therefore that's what they should be discussing about. That's what they should be discussing in the discussion. Are the conclusions valid? As I said before, there should be a question or an aim, methods, results, conclusions. The conclusions should be based on the results, and the conclusions should relate to the questions and aims. So this is called internal validity. Is it valid? One thing that the paper should never finish with, what are the words that a paper should never finish with? More research should be done. If the authors write that, then please ask them to remove it. It's a terribly deflating way to finish a life's work. More research should be done. The abstract. It's often the only thing that's ever read. It must be absolutely clear. As a reviewer, you should go through the abstract word by word to indicate that every word needs to be there and everything is correct. It has to address the primary question and the primary outcome and should include actual data along with 95% confidence interval. And the conclusion of the abstract, those two sentences are probably the most important sentences in the entire paper. So they're the ones you have to focus on and make sure that those conclusions are valid, because those are the two sentences that are most likely to get read.